things that don't belong to him on the surface. But otherwise, I'm just going to kind of clean house. But with the clearance deficiency, where monocytes, where macrophages are not engulfing these dead cells at a fast enough rate, the inner contents of the cell, and primarily the nuclear contents of the cell, the DNA of the cell, comes out onto the surface. It comes out of the body of the cell, so to speak. And when that happens, immune cells, other lymphocytes come and they see this stuff lying around and they go, what is all this junk? Why is there all of this nuclear protein lying around here? Maybe this is the problem. Maybe what's going on here is we should attack this stuff. And eventually, there's a cell line that has an affinity for that material, for that nuclear material. That's our own kind of, our own genetic material. That starts to be like, okay, it's associated with what's called the danger signal. The danger signal causes that cell to replicate, and then you get a lot of antibodies that are directed not at some foreign body, but at your own tissues. This is what causes these autoimmune diseases, this clearance deficiency. Talking about these rheumatoid arthritis or rheumatoid disorders, that's where the body is basically attacking its own tissues. A classic example of this would be lupus, systemic lupus erythematosus, which you may or may not know someone who has that. But basically what happens is the body starts to produce autoantigens, and the main way to test for lupus, I mean there are a number of tests including the history, but the main way to test is to look at anti-nuclear antibodies, this ANA test. And basically what you're looking for are antibodies that react with your own nuclear protein. And these antibodies develop in short because the monocytes aren't clearing them out of the body at a fast enough rate there.
What makes the monocytes not go faster?
That's a good question. So, what causes the dysfunction in the first place? I mean, from a Chinese medicine perspective, you might say it's sort of a spleen deficiency. So, chronic stress, chronic worry can cause a spleen deficiency. Another, I can't answer that directly. I can't tell you what the cause of lupus is, but one thing that they found is that somehow lipstick use is associated with systemic lupus erythematosus. So this becomes interesting because the part of the body that's related to the spleen are the lips, these ropes of muscle. And when you look at the person's face, you can tell sort of the quality of their flesh. Are the lips full? Are they pursed? Are they dry? Are they wet from the lips there? And they look kind of like, you know, maybe like snakes or like worms. That's probably not good, but it looks like two pieces of flesh there. You can definitely see the quality of the person's circulation in the lips there. They turn blue when you're cold and whatnot. Somehow, though, using lipstick is associated with systemic lupus erythematosus. Maybe it's the case that the lipstick causes the cells that are on the surface to not be able to be engulfed by the monocytes, and then they start to decay and their nuclear material is presented to other lymphocytes, and that's what's going on. I have no idea. It's something that's happening there. But there are a number of other things that I know are contributors, or they believe are contributors to lupus, including breast implants and things like that.
What's the connection to the example of the damp felt on the shoulder? Is that just the dampness and penetrating the body?
That's a very good question. That's a very good question. I think basically what's happening, or what I would think was happening there, is the spleen, even though it can control this damp, when you look at the character for the spleen, there's a hexagram that's associated, which is all these solid lines. All solid lines. And the character for that, I might be mistaken on the writing, but it's this gan. This character here, gan. In the I Ching, if you look at the I Ching, sometimes this is the first hexagram, sometimes it's the second. But it's oftentimes translated as gan, the creative. But gan, this character here, it means dry. It actually means dry or to dry. And so somehow the spleen works well, or really likes that sort of dry, sunny weather, and it doesn't do so well in it doesn't do so well with the damp type of weather there. Physiologically, I think the only thing that I could think of is, that exposure to damp would probably cause, the area to be cooler. For one thing, the body would have a hard time keeping it warm enough, so circulation would tend to become more sluggish. And if the circulation were more sluggish, there'd be more time for older senescent cells to die and kind of rot. Just as, out in nature, if you're traveling or something like that, you can walk really fast over dry ground, but when you come to like damp ground, it really slows you down and keeps you from kind of getting where you're going. The other thing is because Gan in Chinese medicine, correct me if I'm wrong, you found, but it has also something to do with cleaning, kind of keeping things clean. I might be wrong on that. But in any case, when we clean, if your house is dry and clean, everything is kind of cleaned up. But when it's damp, just as we saw that sheng tu, the dampness tends to cause and collect and cause all these things to sort of stick together and agglutinate. And in the spleen, when the spleen is working properly, it does respond to periods of rest and digestion. The spleen actually, when you're resting and digesting, it tends to actually expand slightly. And when you're active, it tends to contract slightly in size. So it increases in size when you're resting and digesting. When you're resting and digesting, all this foreign material and whatnot, all this blood can then go through the spleen, and the spleen has a chance to sort out the dirty from the clean. And no one that I know really likes to rest and digest in a damp environment. I mean, if you're eating or if you're just relaxing, kind of the one thing that you don't want to be exposed to is dampness. You can always put on more sweaters and whatnot, but if your environment is damp, it's very uncomfortable. I lived in a school bus that I converted into an RV here in town through the winter, and it was never the cold that bothered me. What always got me was the incessant damp. Until I put a fireplace in there, until I could kind of kick the damp out of there, I could never be comfortable. I itched, my skin felt kind of clammy and uncomfortable. I couldn't sleep well, I couldn't think straight. That all had to do, I think, with the dampness there. And I don't know if that answers your question. So something that's maybe kind of interesting here with the in this line from chapter 5 is it says, this character here may or may not be to you. This means like in its 变动, when it sort of changes or transmutes, when it has to kind of adjust to something maybe that's unfavorable to it. 微越, it becomes 越. This character 越 means nausea or vomiting, to retch. Something in researching for this project I learned was a snake, it will eat something very large, like a mouse, or maybe a small snake that eats a whole mouse, or maybe a python will eat an entire monkey, or something like that. But when it's frightened, or when it believes that it's suddenly going to be attacked or something like that, it's so weighted down by whatever it's eating that it will actually have to vomit up whatever it's got in its mouth. It'll have to vomit the whole thing up in order to be able to escape this yeah here. Physiologically, I'm not exactly sure how that would kind of fit in. The only thing I would say is, oftentimes nowadays in Chinese medicine, when they talk about the spleen, the functions that they attribute to it have to do with digestion, has a lot to do with sort of the gastrointestinal tract and digestion. It doesn't oftentimes have as much to do with immunity and whatnot. And when you think about the fact that the spleen actually produces the mouth and allows these things to come into the body and be assimilated and whatnot, it makes sense that it would be part of the GI tract. In chapter 8 of the Yellow Emperor's Classic, the spleen and the stomach are lumped together in one line and talked about. But in this chapter, in chapter 5, the stomach isn't talked about when it's talking about these 5 organs. They just talk about the spleen in this central region there. So, you may know someone who's had their spleen removed. Yeah?
I have a friend with polymyalgia rheumatica.
Okay.
Is that connected to this?
Well, polymyalgia rheumatica means that they have multiple muscle pains. Rheumatica means that it's mediated by the humoral immune system. So that means that